Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with Season 3, Episode 5, Magic Duel, the episode in which the great and apologetic Trixie comes back with the Alicorn Amulet and uses it to establish a reign of terror. And then she gets beaten by Twilight at the end. Let me go ahead and start by saying I do actually rather like this episode, which is good because I've seen it a lot. Like, a lot. I want to explain why briefly. As many of you are probably aware, my interest in this show originally came from trying to see if it was good enough for my niece, to see if she would like it. Obviously, I decided it was good enough for her, and so occasionally when we had what we called screen time, which is time she could spend playing video games or watching movies or watching TV, she would have requests, like, I want to watch this or I want to play this, right? Well, she would often request that we watch this exact episode of the show, because for whatever reason, she really liked this specific episode. So I've seen this episode like 8 times. Probably more than any other individual episode in the series. Yeah. Yeah, let's get this out of the way. We have a books knocked off the shelves. We have a wah-wah. It's a deliberate wah-wah, but it still counts. And I was debating how many continuity counters, but I'd say I'm going to go ahead and give 2 continuity counters. One for Trixie and one for Pinky's family. And it is actually a decent episode. I mean, it's not the best, but it's decent, which is funny. Because this is another M.A. Larson episode, I believe. Yep, this is yet another M.A. Larson episode. So that's neat. So, why does this random shopkeep have this super powerful cursed amulet? I'm just wondering. Although I did a little looking into it, and again, I'm trying to do as much behind-the-scenes work as I can on the fly. Apparently this guy was specifically a reference to King's Quest VI. Now, I haven't played King's Quest VI, so I'm not sure if there's like a specific connection there between the shopkeep and King's Quest VI having this mega powerful amulet or whatever. I like Dream Whisperer's answer. Because plot. Or rather, because there's no notion of security. Sorry. Everyone else is because plot. Good supply chain. Yeah, anyways. This is, if I'm not mistaken, the very first usage of the word alicorn in the show as well, which is something that'll become more common later. It's actually kind of misused here because it doesn't specifically refer to the the winged Pegasi, or excuse me, the horned Pegasi, or the winged unicorn if you prefer. But that is, if you'll notice, the amulet itself does show it has the wings and it does have the unicorn horn, so it does actually kind of tie it up together. Either way. The first thing I want to talk about is the amulet, which is why I'm going to talk about it last. So the next thing I want to talk about is Fluttershy, who is just really, really adorable in this episode. Multiple times. Like, a lot. Oh, God. Is it going to be okay? If you hurt them, I swear I'll destroy you, Twilight. And then there's a bit which, to this day, still actually makes me laugh, where she's looking at... And I've seen this episode like 8 times. She's looking at the animals like, oh, God, you don't understand. They're all so terrified. And it cuts to the animals, and they're like, yay, woo, I can't wait. And, of course, the animals have tons of fun. Of course they do. I mean, first of all, someone with telekinesis kind of flying you through the air, that sounds like fun, right? Do you remember as a kid being tossed into the air by someone, an adult? I used to do that with my niece, whoo, whoo. It's a very similar concept. Yeah, you do have to trust that person. That is valid. But I mean, Twilight, I can kind of see the appeal there. So, continued usage of magic coloring as relevant when it comes to the magical auras in this show. We've seen several times Trixie's aura is this kind of light green looking thing, and when she puts on the amulet, it is very clearly a very blood red. I actually did a little looking into it, and I couldn't find any other instance at a glance. I didn't do a deep dive because I only have like 30 minutes to do this, but I couldn't find any other reference to a big red aura when it comes to magic usage like that. I'm not sure if it's completely unique, but it's interesting to think about because, again, it kind of makes me think, where the hell did this thing come from? But again, talk about the amulet later. The relevant point is, of course, her magic is actually different. And then she details her poor and horrible past, all the horrible things she had to go through. She had to go work at a rock farm. We see Pinky's father there, which is a nice little bit of continuity. And, of course, Pinky herself is like, hey, should have been grateful to work at that. And then something happens, which I'm curious if you guys caught. So what happens is she does a spell that is to say, Trixie does a spell she doesn't do the rest of the series. She pulls up a little mouse cursor and a little digitized trash can and drag and drops Pinky's mouth into the trash can. You're probably thinking, what's this have to do with anything, Laura? Kathleen Barr voiced Dot Matrix on the show Reboot. Now, I don't know if that's actually something that's a deliberate reference or not, but it is something that kind of got a grin out of me because I liked Reboot. It was a good show. It was a show that was way ahead of its time in many different ways. And I think I've mentioned before that Kathleen Barr voiced Dot Matrix on Reboot, so, you know, who... Anyways. I was going to say, how many of you remember Reboot? Anybody? Does anybody remember that show? It was like, it wasn't the first CGI show, but it was one of the earlier CGI shows out there. But ignoring the CGI, which has aged terribly, it was nevertheless surprisingly well animated and surprisingly good of a show. Yeah, it was the first good CGI show. I'll actually agree with that. Beast Wars is another one, which looks kind of like crap, but was actually still a pretty good show despite the aged CGI, so credit where credit is due. Either way. So the magic duel is interesting if you pay attention to it. Trixie almost always does big brute force stuff, and stuff that's actually hurtful. In fact, she nearly harmed those ponies until Twilight intervened. Twilight usually thinks her way around Trixie's magic in return. Now, that was probably deliberate because it shows two things. One, Trixie is shown many times, especially after this, to not actually be powerful magically. That's why she's a magician, as opposed to a mage. Because she doesn't actually know how to do magic in the strictest sense of the word. So, yeah, she does the brute force thing. Whereas Twilight, who's been a mage since she was a child, is someone who knows how to operate and use magic, and so she's the one actually using it properly. It also, of course, ties in with one of the main themes of the work, which we'll get to in just a minute. But yeah, she full-on overpowers, and, oh, while we're on the subject, Twilight, the closest thing she does to hurtful is make the mustache happen on Trixie. Which actually looks surprisingly good on her, but let's not get into that. But yes, Trixie is A-moving, and Twilight is using strategy. It's just, A-moving can work when you have a serious death ball going. Like, there's, at a certain point, power will overwhelm skill. That's a very common constant in real life, but especially in fiction. It's one of my favorite quotes about that, which is actually from me, admittedly, is, it doesn't matter how good of a boxer you are if you're fighting someone who's got the power of the sun. I know, it sounds like a weird quote. It makes sense in context, I swear. Anyways, so, Twilight loses. Twilight gets kicked out, and she needs... And this leads to the whole, you need to continue outskilling. Zecora needs to trust herself, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter how good of a boxer you are against One Punch Man. But yeah, so Zecora is like, okay, you need to learn. You need to unlearn what you have learned. Okay, can I just say really quick, this is probably my only actual complaint about this episode, is that line. I'm just really sick of that line. It's used in basically all of fiction. You know? You must unlearn what you have learned. Forget everything you know. Good evening, glorious barbarian. Moving on. This leads to a pretty cool scene, mostly because of its real-life parallels. Fluttershy finds the book which actually looks a lot like the book that was in a previous episode with the book about the pool. Anyways, so Fluttershy finds a book, and she just kind of starts talking in the background about how they could possibly deal with this. But she's so shy and uncertain that she's not really speaking up, so nobody's really noticing her. Let me say that again to make it a little more real-life relevant. You're so shy and uncertain that you don't speak up so that other people don't really get your contribution to the work, even though you know what you're talking about. Does that sound a little more familiar? It's actually something I want to talk about, especially with regards to my show, because one of the things I try, and I probably fail at, if I'm being completely honest, but I try very hard to encourage people in chat to share and talk and do whatever they want, because I don't want to I don't want to engender a situation in which that is a thing. Like, I don't want people to be in my chat hesitating to speak up about something, because I've seen that happen in real life many, many times. I don't want them to be the kind of person who is too hesitant or too shy or too uncertain, and I don't want to. Maybe if I just kind of stay quietly back here, it won't be a big deal. You know, that kind of thing. I don't want that. If you want to just lurk, you can just lurk. That's fine. You know, we here at the Lore Walkers, no problems with lurkers. However, I have seen a lot of people otherwise not contribute because of that exact thing, both in school and in work. That is a very common thing I've seen in human psychology. Which leads me to one other thing, though. While that's an awesome thing and very relevant, that scene right there shows more than anything why this is actually a Season 2 episode. For those of you unaware, this was literally a Season 2 episode that got pushed back for various behind-the-scenes reasons. And that kind of... I could just picture someone trying to say, well, the episodes aren't meant to be, you know, told in order anyways. To which I say, well, that's dumb. I hate it when a show tries to show episodes out of order in general, especially since it destroys any possibility of proper continuity or development throughout the course of the show. But more to the point, that in this case especially feels just like an excuse. Right? Either way, Fluttershy is adorable. I know, shocking. Yeah, Firefly, no comment. Yeah, I agree, Savacom. They don't treat Fluttershy the way they should. Especially since in the rest of the episode, they treat each other in the way that friends probably should and would, you know? Yeah, Clone Wars was bad with that too, I agree. And, ugh. Quake is okay, but I haven't really liked it since 2. Quake 3 I didn't really get into, no. Now, this then leads to the big thing. The Dangerous Mission. First of all, I love the Dangerous Mission outfit that Rarity makes for her. It's very chic, very stylish. And I love how she's all freaking, I want to be brave at home with my teddy bear. That tends to kind of line up with, you know, Fluttershy and the way she is, especially at this point. And her being calmed down by Zecora's tea. That was a nice little thing there. Yeah, in a closet with her teddy bear. But this then leads to a part of the show that I actually do like, and that's the fact that they don't show the plan in advance. Yeah, of course the animals help her, why wouldn't they? So there's 2 types of plan approaches when it comes to fiction. And these are very obvious. You either show the plan in advance, or you don't. If you show the plan in advance, you are doing that so that the audience can know what is supposed to happen, and then when things go completely off the rails, they can see how it adapts, right? That's a very common thing with heist movies or episodes, for example. If they don't show the plan in advance, that's usually because the fiction intends the plan to go off without a hitch, and so they just want the audience to be guessing what the plan is as they're going through it. I think this one clearly sits in the latter category. Yeah, you can also show the plan as developing. See Matrix 2, for an example. That Matrix Reloaded does that. Although, I don't think Matrix Reloaded was a good example of that, but let's not get into that right now. Point being, this, of course, is an episode written by M.A. Larson, and this again shows his kind of sci-fi / other television and writing leanings, because the way he does it is he very clearly... This is a guy, right? I mean, I don't know. The name's M.A. That could be anything. Meredith? Mike? Marchesterson, I don't know. Anyways, the way M.A. Larson sets this up is it's actually pretty subtle, the way the plan goes forward. Like, Twilight pulls basically the most classic magician's trick on both the audience and Trixie. The unrelated bystander trick. You know the one, right? Actually, Flim and Flam will later use this exact same trick in this very show. AKA, I need a random person from the audience. You, sir. And it's someone who's planted there who knows the trick and is going to be going along with it, right? But the episode does a good job of selling it. She just kind of randomly asks for Applejack and Rarity, and they're just like, okay, sure. You know, shrug. It's nicely understated. It's very well done, I think. Mitchell is apparently his name. Got it, Mitchell. It's always M.A. on the credits, so I'm just kind of presuming here. Anywho. Lol, Sierra Mike. That would be the military version of the plan. Anyway, so she calls them up, and of course they start doing the trickery. And this naturally lines up with one of the amusing parts of the episode, ignoring the obvious bit about how... she says she uses the magic of friendship, but that's not really 100% true, is it? What she actually does is she outskills the person who outpowers her. And she uses stage magic against the stage magician. Both of these points work pretty well, in my opinion. And I think that it serves as a nice ironic point and helps with the narrative in general, that she's able to pull off both of these within the same thing. I also tend to rather enjoy the sequence where she showcases back and forth, because if you're paying attention, the signs are there. I will freely admit I didn't actually see it until like my 3rd or 5th or 8th viewing. But for my favorite example is the eye color. You can tell the eyes are different based on who is what at any given point in time. The most obvious one being the old Applejack clearly has orange eyes, which is Granny Smith's eyes. There's also, let's see, I actually wrote down a few here. The wing stylings is different between Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash. And this is probably the one that I never noticed before. Twilight's magic aura doesn't change when she equips the amulet, despite the fact that we've seen that that's a thing. And in fact, immediately after Trixie taking off the amulet, her aura goes right back to the light pink that is her usual style. Just nice little stuff. It's well written, right? It's well designed. It's well presented. There's details. I love details, and I love the way they present this stuff. Even if it's not anything super fascinating, at least it's very well presented. I think Trixie is terrible at magic, and will remain so forever. It's light pink, isn't it? I'm pretty sure it's light pink. Shoot, now you're going to make me look it up. Hang on. Oh, where is it? Hang on. Pause. Oh yeah, no, that's totally light pink. That is definitely light pink. Okay, confirmed and verified. Moving on. So, I love this scene. This leads me to talking about... Well, actually, before I go into that, I just want to mention, it's interesting. I think this is the first time we've seen horses in this show. With the Saddle Arabians. By the way, haha. And the episode definitely ends in a wah-wah. A deliberate wah-wah, but a wah-wah nonetheless. And you'll notice that Fluttershy has a lot more lines in an episode that is generally absent Pinkie Pie. I have been told from interviews that the woman, whose name I can't think of right now, who voices Fluttershy and Pinkie Pie, it hurts her voice to do Pinkie Pie. And so it kind of makes sense that they would try to accommodate that within this. But anyways, let's talk about the amulet. So I suppose the most obvious question I could jump into here is, how much of this do you think was the amulet, and how much of it do you think was Trixie? Obviously, there is at least a combination going on. You know, the amulet wasn't completely mind-controlling her. And yet, at the same time, it is very, very obviously that the amulet was influencing her. You know, very dark-sided kind of a way, right? This is clearly not the real Trixie in this episode. How much of that is Trixie's fault and how much of that is the Amulet's fault? That's the question. I will say, and several people in chat mentioned this, she does tend to get a little bit too scot-free for all the crap she did in this episode. But on the other hand, if we're being honest, she didn't do any real permanent damage either, which I think is something they did on purpose to showcase that. I mean, I'm not saying she was a good person, but there's a lot worse things that can happen even in this show with regards to, you know, being an evil person. And Spike would do it to Autoslava. Those poor yokels. The great and powerful Trixie does not trust Wheels. That's part of the reason I look at that and I think that at least some of that is just the amulet. You can't tell me that there's any part of her that thinks that Wheels are things not to be trusted. As she gets weirder and weirder. Yeah, I've heard that theory too, Baron. Truthfully, I don't think this would be a somber thing personally, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was. It's possible, Ruth. I mean, don't mistake me. Obviously, she was originally out for revenge. But based on what we know of Trixie, both before this and after this, because, spoiler, she comes back to the show, she's not exactly a great person, but she's not that terrible either. This is probably someone who wanted to come up, show up, Twilight, you're like, ha ha ha! And then once she had her revenge of showing up Twilight, you know, she was going to move on and get back to her life, right? Instead, well, she shows up Twilight, and then she banishes Twilight, and then she conquers the town. And you can see how that just kind of distends out of control. We could also relate this to alcohol if we wanted to. I know people always say that alcohol is a thing that allows you to be who you really are, but based on real-life evidence, I would say, no, alcohol tends to make you an idiot. I mean, really. Obviously, you are still the instigator of thought, but people who are substantially drunk tend to think things and do things that they would never actually do. That 1,000 mental blocks would prevent from ever reaching the point of actually being an action that they would take. Because we as human beings, like it or not, have thousands of thoughts that just fire off in the back of the brain constantly, and experience in time has taught us to filter those out and crush a lot of those down, right? Right? This is actually something I talked about recently when it came to Star Trek. This is why I directly parallel this to the Amulet, because it's entirely possible the Amulet is basically just kind of letting these random firing off thoughts in the back of the mind being like, and actually take actionable form, rather than just being a random thought that you immediately ignore. I actually agree with that, Savicon. Which is funny, because she'd probably win that one. It's so reasonable when you had a drink. Yeah, it is a form of a power trip, I agree. Now, we don't know if the Amulet's addictive, and I don't think it matters. But this leads me to talking about the Amulet itself. And I have a theory. A lore theory. I did look it up, and I'll go ahead and tell you, there's no information on what the Amulet is, or why. It is referenced in the future when Trixie comes back, but that's it. No, I'll tell you what I think about the Amulet. I think the Amulet was created by someone to do exactly what it says on the tin, to amplify your existing magic damage. Here's the catch. This setting doesn't work that way. I talk constantly about the pattern and how so much of the setting fits within the concept of the pattern, but I also have to point out that the pattern itself is not necessarily natural, and at the same time is something that has to be worked for. It's something that people have to constantly maintain. Otherwise we have the Badlands, right? I think what this thing does is it tries to force magic, and since magic is friendship, you already see where I'm going with this on this general concept. That because of the fact that this thing amplifies magic, what it does is it basically forces you out of the pattern. Amplifying your direct magical damage basically at a at a direct detriment to you as an individual. It is entirely possible, if my theory is even remotely correct here, that if Trixie had kept using this amulet, she might have reached a point where she couldn't come back from it, where she would have never actually been able to restore her original self, because she would have effectively burnt off enough of her mentality or personality or soul, if you want to call it that. And all that would be left is this thing, which is warped and twisted by the usage of the amulet. Yeah, attack up, sanity down. Thoughts to think on. And yeah, this again does kind of line up with Sombra and the idea that he wanted to force power. That he wanted to insist on that at the expense of those around him. Well, that's an interesting question, Lord Harrimont, because we'll cover that more in the future. But I do have to point out that those beings who are usually not ponies, who are outside the pattern, usually their lives are bettered by being brought into the pattern. The Yaks and the Griffins are both excellent examples of that. So, within the confine of the setting, I'm going to go with yeah. Because the whole point of the pattern isn't that you must follow this exact will because I am the Force, Star Wars. It's more along the lines of the fact that the pattern is how people fit together. Is the idea of, and I've talked about this before, the ideas of just being a decent person, right? Like, that is basically what the pattern boils down to, is the way we fit together, by being decent with each other and decent to each other. Like, I keep calling it the pattern, but that's really more of a mathematical term, rather than, like, I don't think there's some literal entity that is the pattern, right? There could be. I just don't think there is. Like, the Force, I don't want to get on Star Wars too much, but the Force is almost universally portrayed in the EU and the AU as a natural entity. What I mean by that is it cares about nature, not individuals or lives or good or bad. It's basically an amoral force. So if the Force, the will of the Force can and does lead to really horrible things happening, because that way, you know, the plants will grow and these things and blah, 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 right? It may occasionally lead to good as well, but it doesn't do so deliberately because it's amoral. It doesn't care, right? That's the Force. And you can see why I make a point to distinguish the pattern from the Force. So who made the pattern? Well, actually, if from what we know now, granted, I haven't seen the last 2 seasons, but from what we know now, it looks like basically just the ponies made the pattern. Not deliberately or not even intentionally. It just kind of happened when the original 3 groups just kind of unified and became friends, legitimately and genuinely. You remember in, what's the name of the episode? Hearthwarming Eve, I think, which is the Christmas episode we already covered. There was the Pegasi, there were the Earth ponies, and there was the unicorns, and they just kind of came together. Let me try a slightly different tactic here. I was going to use an event horizon as an example, but let's use a slightly different example here. So hang on, Lord Harrimont, hear me out. Let's say you're in a car, okay? Now let's say your car gets 10 miles to the gallon exactly, and let's say you have a 5-gallon tank. So you can go 50 miles, right? So if you were to draw a circle around the very center of the car, 50 miles in radius, that would be the pattern of how far you could reach, right? And you probably already see where I'm going with this. Because the idea here is, it's not literally a thing. There is no circle. It's not if you drive around there, you'll suddenly ka-konk. Oh shoot, I went over the circle. And now the car runs out of the gas. No, it's more of a mathematical expression of something, rather than a literal thing. That is how I think of the pattern. I don't think that there's literally a circle surrounding Equestria and everything must follow this exact grid framework that's built in. I think it's more of a mathematical expression of how they are and what they are. This is why I also distinguish it from the Force, because the Force is an actual thing. The Force is a literal, tangible essence that has its own mentality and ideology. But I don't think there is such a thing as the pattern. I think there is a concept such as the pattern. My opinion. Exactly, Shikor. The pattern grows because more people are unifying, more people are together, more people are cool with each other. Now, I have to admit, so Lord Haramont says, how could something that powerful be created accidentally if it's artificial? I don't know, but that actually really appeals to me personally. I love the idea that they just kind of stumbled upon it, right? And without even really fully understanding what they were doing, they just kind of developed this thing and kind of pushed it. And I would bet money that there are ponies who are aware of what I call the pattern. And I would bet money that there are ponies who are pushing the expansion, the distribution, whatever you want to call it, of the pattern. But I also very strongly believe that most ponies aren't even aware of it as a concept. That don't even think of it as a thing, right? You know, someone like Celestia is probably aware of how important this is to Equestria's prosperity, whereas someone like, say, Bon Bon probably hasn't even heard of the concept. She just hangs out with her friends and is cool. She has a place within it. She has chosen her place within it, but she doesn't even see it. Possible, Lord Haramont. And I don't have an answer to that, truthfully. Although, considering that we do know that the various ponies were not really doing all that well prior to the event of Hearthwarming Eve, I mean... It is also possible, if we're to continue to really theorycraft on this one, that the pattern is unique, not just because it's ponies being cool with each other, but that it's different ponies being cool with each other. In short, that it is specifically the unification of Earth, Pegasi, and Magic that makes the pattern. That Pegasi were cool with Pegasi, but that didn't work. Or unicorns were cool with unicorns, but that didn't work. All that did was, have them being cool with each other. It was the three combined that formed the Triforce. Yeah, the Mass Effect thing. Honestly, I can just say the Mass Effect thing. It is also possible, if we were to continue theory crafting on this, because the pattern isn't a literal thing. It's not a ditch circle around the car, right? As I was pointing out with my earlier analogy. It's entirely possible that the pattern actually existed just in pockets beforehand, right? And it would come and go based on who was doing what and where. But the initial momentum starter, the thing that started the avalanche going, was the three tribes unifying in the events of Hearthwarming Eve. And from there, because it basically allowed it to hit critical mass. Again, metaphorically speaking. And start developing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing until we have Equestria. Food for thought. By the way, I do want to say I don't think Discord would have made an amulet like this. It just doesn't seem like his style, really. Yeah, exactly, Lord Haramont. This would... I say it's an artificial thing, and I stand by that statement. But in the same concept that civilization is an artificial construct, right? Again, actually, if I'm being completely honest, you could use the word pattern and replace it with the word civilization, and actually there's a lot of parallels between those two, and the way I'm using it here. Because, again, there's no literal, tangible thing for civilization. Civilization is the nature in which things interact and coordinate with each other. And which kind of ties up with the pattern idea. Either way, whoever made this amulet, and again, we never know. I did some looking at it. Whoever made the amulet, I think the amulet was being designed and built specifically to go against the pattern, to go against harmony, if you will. Because, ignoring the obvious power-boosting thing, within the confines of the setting, that power has to come from somewhere. And we see in a much future episode that every pony, even just basic Earth ponies, all have some kind of magical power, right? But the amulet itself also obviously twists the person using it to the point where they don't fit anymore. my thoughts. I will say, a lot of my reasoning for saying that Discord would not do this comes from future episodes, not past ones, so make that what you will. I could see that too, Savacom. I mean, as much as I love conquering things, if I'm being honest, the very concept of conquest is probably not the kind of thing that fits within the mindset of most of the ponies in the pattern, in the harmony. Because conquest, by its very nature, is kind of anti-harmonic, right? And then you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with anything? Well, Trixie conquered Ponyville, so... by force, no less. But future Discords, when Discord's interesting... Well, I should be seeing Discord in a couple weeks here. And when he'll actually be a character. I could see that, Ruth. And Lord knows that Trixie does try to actually have a real friend in the future. We'll get to that episode when we get there. It is my opinion that Trixie is not that bad of a pony, but she's also not that good of one either. And I think that's part of why she apologized, because she's not that horrible and she did feel bad, but in so doing, she gets to elevate herself as well, right? Because let's be honest, Trixie's biggest flaw is her pride. No question on that one, right? Anyways, let me update the counters here really quick. Well, we'll get to the episode where I hate Discord much later. Excuse me. Because that episode actually kind of pisses me off, if I'm being completely blunt. And by kind of, I mean massively. Like, a lot. I mean, I can make it make sense, but it doesn't mean it doesn't piss me off. There we go. So that's all the continuity counters, or the counters updated. I am going to go ahead and chop off the local recording.